delighted to welcome you all to this distinguished lecture this afternoon for Cynthia Dwork. We have people here from all over campus, I can tell. So that's one of the things that we like to do, is attract people from other parts of campus to get to know what we're doing here. And Cynthia is a good person for you to hear from. She is currently a distinguished scientist at Microsoft Research. She is planning to spend some time at Berkeley beginning in March at the Simons Institute. Cynthia has, for those of you that don't know, she's made seminal contributions in cryptography and distributed computing. She's a recipient of the Edgar W. Dijkstra Prize, which recognized some of her earliest work establishing the pillars on which every fault-tolerant system has been built for decades. Please, there are more seats. Make yourselves at home. She's also very well known for placing privacy-preserving data analysis on a mathematically rigorous foundation. A cornerstone of this work is differential privacy, a strong privacy guarantee frequently permitting highly accurate data analysis. Cynthia is also quite distinguished. She is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I am really pleased to welcome Cynthia and hand it over to her.
So, thank you very much for the lovely introduction and for coming to the talk. I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to need two people for this talk, so let me introduce you to Helen Nissenbaum, a philosopher who studies philosophical issues that arise in the context of new technologies. And Helen is the person who introduced me to the questions of privacy in public. So in particular, when I talked to Helen about, can you all hear me? Am I speaking loudly enough? Okay. So when she was talking to me about her problem about privacy in general and what does privacy mean when you walk down the street and people are recording things with surveillance cameras and so on, and I thought, is there some part of this that I could actually put on a firm mathematical foundation? And I bit off the easiest possible piece, which I would call privacy-preserving data analysis. I thought this might be something that I could actually put some boundaries around. So the scenario is pretty straightforward. You have a database. The database is rich in very sensitive information about people. But you want to be able to use it to learn not necessarily so much about the individuals in the data set, but about the population from which the data set was drawn. You want to learn about people as a whole. And we'll consider various scenarios, but mostly today we focus on the situation where we have a data analyst who somehow or other interacts with this data set, which I've drawn here as asking a question and getting an answer, and asking another question and getting an answer. That question might be, give me a list of the following 2,500 statistics. That's fine, but it's question and answer. All right. So there are a lot of applications for this kind of work. Clearly, analysis of census data and the allocation of resources that census data are intended for. Epidemic detection based on over-the-counter drug purchases. Analysis of loan application data for systematic evidence of discrimination, for example. And this is a really old problem. It has a history dating back at least 50 years. Now, one thing that a lot of people will talk about is de-identifying data. So in the de-identification idea, we take the original database and we run it through some mechanism or an algorithm, and we produce some kind of smaller object, has less information in it. It's called a de-identified data set. And in fact, once you do that, the original data can go away, the algorithm can go away, and the analyst can interact with the data set, the de-identified data set, to her heart's content. And the only thing I'm going to say about that in this talk is that de-identified data isn't. So either it's not de-identified or it's not data anymore. And there are a host of results in the literature that illustrate this point, and I'm not going to spend any more time on it. So then you can say, well, what about just statistics? So the analyst, and there may be many analysts, but the analysts ask questions, give me this statistic, give me that statistic, they get answers. What about that problem? Can we solve that? And if you're not careful, I would call this, before I go on, you have some intuition that says that a statistic is just a statistic. It's not telling about an individual, it's telling about a group, right? You're thinking average, you're thinking median, and somehow the data of everybody are involved in that. And it doesn't feel like it's going to be a personal compromise. So I call this the statistics masquerade. Here's an example of a simple thing that can go wrong. It's called a differencing attack. So let's say we ask two questions now, not just one statistic, but two statistics. The first one is, say, how many members of the House of Representatives have the sickle cell trait? So your feeling is that the answer to that question is completely benign. It's not going to compromise the privacy of anybody in the House of Representatives. It's a large set of people, and so on. And then there's a second question, which also by itself seems completely benign because it's about a large group of people. And this second question is, how many members of the House, other than the Speaker, have the sickle cell trait? And of course, if you have the exact answers to both of those questions and you subtract one from the other, and you learn the status of the Speaker of the House. That's a sort of special case, or could be viewed as a special case of a much more general kind of attack, which I like to call the Big Bang attack. It's also frequently called dinornissim, or simply Dini attacks in the literature, because the first one was carried out by Dinur and Nissim in their seminal 2003 work. And I don't have time to explain the Big Bang attack, but the way I like to summarize it is a fundamental law of information recovery that says that overly accurate estimates of too many statistics is blatantly non-private. Okay, so that's going to be that is a fundamental law, and it's proven in many different ways with a lot of different variations. So I kind of like this quote, and I'm actually going to read it to you. It says, these results show that existing designs for query systems do not adequately prevent disclosure of confidential data by combinatorial inference. This observation is not new. However, it has only been recently that we have begun to understand the myriad of inference techniques that may be used. We are continually finding that compromise is easier than once thought. Would anybody like to guess when this was written? Okay, so this was 1980. Okay. And things have gotten worse. I would like to draw your attention just to one more of these surprising attacks, and maybe at the end we'll end up coming back to this example. This is a result from 2008. And suppose for the moment that we were single-strand DNA creatures, so that each of us could be represented by just this string of A, C, Gs, and Ts. There are certain locations called SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, in which there's a large amount of variation between people. And in a genome-wide association study, people look at these locations and they try to see, given a case group of people who have been diagnosed with a certain illness and a control group of healthy people, they try to see if in this location the distribution of the ACs, Gs, and Ts is different in the case group than it is in the healthy population. They're looking to see which locations in the DNA might be associated with the disease. And what Homer et al. Showed is that given a sample of DNA, so for example, from my water bottle, it is in theory possible to determine whether I participated in the genome-wide association study, and in particular whether I was in the case group. And the interesting thing is that my DNA may show that I'm vulnerable to a certain illness, but if I'm in the case group, it means I have been diagnosed as having that illness. So this was considered very serious, and as a result, the National Institutes of Health changed their policy regarding access to these statistics. And these are just statistics. They say things like 96.2%, 95%, you know, this is just statistics. Okay. In addition, things are worse because the results of data analysis are being used. And information in general flows in very mysterious ways. So for example, through the billing information in Facebook via finely targeted advertising, it was possible to determine, let's say, if Helen, this was a real example with another person, well, it would be possible to determine if Helen tangos by targeting an ad to somebody who actually looks just like Helen, but in addition satisfies the interested in tango property. And if you're charged for that ad, it means Helen is interested in tango. Similarly, I could see if she was interested in sumo suits. And an attack like this was launched against Facebook, and Facebook changed the way it carried out some of the targeted advertising to try to compensate. And I really, really like this example. By combining product recommendations or similar items lists, things like people who bought this also bought that, by combining those evolving recommendations using the time element with blogging about things that you might have purchased, an adversary may infer purchases that you made that you did not choose to blog about. And this attack also was launched successfully. Okay, so LaTanya Sweeney brilliantly said, computer science got us into this mess. Can computer science get us out of it? So that's what we're going to try to do. What is privacy-preserving data analysis? What is going to be our definition of success? Or, if we're the adversary, what is the definition of success for the adversary? What does it mean to break privacy? So if you're going to try to put something on a mathematically rigorous foundation, you have to have a mathematically rigorous definition. And we all know that privacy is a kind of funny, emotional thing, and it's hard to specify concretely. Okay, so first attempt. Here's this database. It contains data about Helen. So my first attempt will be that I can't learn anything new about Helen, or rather the adversary, the privacy adversary, can't learn anything new about Helen. So this certainly takes into account the fact that Helen publishes papers, and she gives lectures, and she has a website, and you can learn a lot about her, right? And that's fine. But what you want from your privacy-preserving statistical database is that in the course of doing statistical data analyses, the adversary shouldn't learn anything about Helen that isn't part of the public domain already. And the problem with this is, if this is really the goal, then what is the point of this statistical data analysis? So to make that more clear, let's say that I am from Mars, and I don't know much about people, and I think that all people, all humans, have 2 left feet. I don't know. I think that all people have 2 left feet, and I certainly think Helen has 2 left feet. And then I interact with this database, and I learn that the vast majority of humans have 1 left foot and 1 right foot. And so I have learned something about Helen. Certainly my view of what her feet are like has changed, right? I've learned something about her. Did I compromise her privacy? So I'm going to take the position that we didn't. And here's another way of seeing this. I would have learned the same things about Helen if Helen had been replaced by another random member of the population. What I learned was absolutely not specific to Helen. It was about people. This is a property known as stability in learning. It says that you learn the same, you draw the same conclusions, even if there are small perturbations in your data set. So, Helen leaves, LaTanya joins, Helen is replaced by LaTanya, small changes in the data set. And all of this now is about privacy, right? This is going to be our notion of privacy, that we're going to learn the same things even if we make small changes in the data set. What about the data analysis part? Why is it that if we satisfy this notion of privacy, we have even a hope of being able to carry out real data analysis? So stability is a very important property in machine learning. and it prevents overfitting. So in particular, what that means is if your algorithm must be stable if you're going to be able to take what you have learned and apply it to the rest of the population from which your data set was drawn. That's called generalizability. So what we see is that privacy and generalizability are actually aligned. And so you hear a lot about this tension between privacy and utility, and there is a tension. I'm not going to say that there isn't. But there is also a sense in which privacy and being able to learn about a population are aligned. Okay. So now we come to the actual mathematical definition. In order to explain this carefully, we're going to need a couple of concepts. So first of all, we have algorithms that work on data and produce outputs. And for reasons that I cannot explain, we call those mechanisms. I don't know when that started. You know, I was surely at fault, but I just can't remember why. Okay. Now, in this definition of differential privacy, there are two parameters, epsilon and delta. For now, forget about delta. Delta will be 0. Okay, later, there's one thing I wanted to tell you about where delta is non-zero, but for now, just make it 0. Okay, so we're talking about epsilon differential privacy. We also look at what we call adjacent data sets, or data sets that differ in one element. So remember, our notion of privacy was that the same things should be learned whether Helen was in the data set or not, right? So think of two data sets as being adjacent or differing in one element if one of them is contained in the other and the larger one has the data of just one more person. Those are neighboring data sets, okay? So the last thing that we need to know is we have algorithms. Two things. We have algorithms. Our algorithm, our mechanism, takes a database and produces an output. But it also takes other inputs. In particular, we say that it flips coins or it takes random bits as an input. So when you have fixed your data set and now the algorithm runs, and in the course of running it flips some coins and makes some random choices based on those coin outputs, it doesn't just always produce a single output, rather it produces a distribution on outputs, probability distribution on outputs. Okay, and the last concept is we can now call an event any subset of the outputs that it produces. With those concepts, we say that the mechanism M gives epsilon differential privacy if for every pair of data sets differing in just one element and every possible event, the probability that we see this event when the database is X is almost the same as the probability that we see that event when the data set is instead the neighboring Y. So let's say X is the data set with Helen and Y is just the same, but Helen is now gone. Almost the same I wrote here as 1 plus epsilon. Epsilon was that parameter. So if epsilon were 0, we'd have perfect privacy, but we'd say that on adjacent databases, we always get exactly the same probability distribution on outcomes. And that would turn out to mean that you never get any information about the data whatsoever. Okay, not what we're looking for. So we take epsilon to be a little bit larger than 0, but still we want it to be very small. And I have probabilities here. What are these? Where do the probabilities come from? The probabilities are over the coin flips of our algorithm. They are not probabilities over who happens to be in the data set. We have no control over that. But we do have control over the coin flips of our algorithm. That is, we can be sure that the random bit generator is working correctly. Okay. Now, in fact, this isn't quite the definition that 1 plus epsilon is really e to the epsilon, which, when epsilon is small, is very close to 1 plus epsilon. And when epsilon is 0, that's just 1. So it's the same. And that's the right definition. It's the formal definition. So suppose I'm not in the data set Y, but I am in the data set X. And let's say that my worry is that I'm going to be busted for growing marijuana because somebody has measured power consumption, something like that, from a data set, or sees statistics that were produced from a data set on energy consumption, okay? So I'm not really worried about this happening to me if I'm not in the data set. So but what differential privacy says is, if this event is very unlikely to happen if I'm not in the data set, then it remains unlikely to happen when I am in the data set. Because I'm not in the data set, remember we're taking delta to be 0 for now, and it's always very, very tiny. If I'm not in the data set, then this quantity here on the right, let's say, is 0. There's no probability that I'm going to be busted based on this. And then the probability on the left would have to be at most 0. Or if the probability is just very small on the right when I'm not there, then it will be very small still on the left when I am there. Now, a lot of times people will talk to you about methods of protecting privacy, and they won't really have rigorous guarantees, and you'll say, well, what if blah, 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 and they say, well, that's really, really unlikely. Oh, that probably, why would an adversary do this? Or where would an adversary get that kind of, or whatever it is. Now, here's my claim. There is no way to know the probabilities of bad events like that. Those are not coin flips that are controlled by my algorithm. They're controlled by who knows what and who accesses what information set when and met somebody on the subway. I mean, there's no way to assign probabilities to those. Differential privacy does not require you to. It says if something bad is unlikely to happen when you're not there, it stays unlikely to happen when you are there. Okay? So it's impossible to know the actual probabilities of bad events. People who tell you something is unlikely simply do not know what they are talking about. It's just true. But here, even though you don't know, you can control the relative risk incurred by joining the data set. Okay. And we call epsilon our measure of privacy loss. Okay. So here are a couple of properties of differential privacy. First of all, we have a sort of nuanced measure of privacy loss. We don't say that something is private versus not private. It's not 0, 1, but we actually have a measurement. And we are, in fact, able, using the mathematical properties, to bound the cumulative privacy loss over many different epsilon differentially private analyses. And this will be on the same database, or even if your data are in multiple databases. Another property is that an adversary's background knowledge is completely irrelevant. So if you've all heard about the Netflix attack or the William Weld, attack on the HMO data set by linkage with the voter registration records. The voter registration records, IMDb, those are sort of background knowledge or auxiliary information. But being differentially private is a property of an algorithm. And it doesn't care who knows what. It's just a promise that the algorithm makes. So it's completely immune not only to what an adversary might have access to now, but what an adversary might have access to, a decade from now. Okay. And finally, where it really gets its power is that it's programmable. Because we understand how the privacy losses accumulate when you have multiple algorithms, multiple differentially private analyses, we can build tiny differentially private primitives for various kinds of calculations, and then we can program with those, and we can just analyze the cumulative loss of the program through our composition bounds. And that gives it a tremendous amount of power. Now, I'd like to tell you about just a very handful of these little primitives, these little privacy-preserving primitives. So 2 of them are randomized response and the addition of symmetric noise. Randomized response. proposed by Warner in 1965 to facilitate questioning about embarrassing or illegal activities when the data subjects might not feel comfortable sharing that information with the researcher. So I want to know whether you X, Y, Z last night. But I actually really just want to know the statistics for the group. I don't really want to know for any individual here. So here are my instructions to you. Flip a coin. Do not tell me the outcome of this coin. If it was heads, flip a second coin and answer answer yes or no according to whether it's heads or tails. So in other words, if your first coin was heads, you're going to answer me randomly. On the other hand, if the first coin was tails, answer honestly. Okay? So the idea here is that if you say, yes, I XYZ'd last night, I don't know whether it's true, and that you're telling me you're in the answer honestly phase, or whether you have answered me randomly and it happened that the random choice said to answer yes. I have no way of knowing, and that's the whole point. So there's no right or wrong answer. That's just, yeah. Now, this is differentially private, and a case analysis basically says the probability that you'll say yes, given that the truth is yes, divided by the probability that you say yes, given that the truth is no, is 3. And the same thing, okay, and why is this true? If the truth is yes, you'll say yes if the first coin is tails, which is probability 1/2. Or the first coin is heads and the second coin is heads, which has probability 1/4. And you add those together, you get 3/4. If the truth is no, you'll say yes only if the first and the second coins are heads, which has probability 1/4. So you take the ratio and you get 3. Why do I care about the ratio? I'm sorry, I should have told you that. Go back to the definition. Remember, pretend that delta is 0. So just divide through by probability that m of y is s, and you want that the ratio of those two probabilities is bounded by e to the epsilon. So that's why we look at ratios. Sorry about that. Okay, back to where we were. Okay, same analysis works for saying no. And so what this ends up saying is that epsilon is, this is 1.098 approximately differentially private. And the key point here, again, is that there were no good answers or bad answers. There were no answers that compromised your privacy versus the ones that didn't. It was the process of generating the answer that gave rise to the privacy. That we didn't know how the answer was generated, whether it was truth or whether it was because the random coins told you to say yes. In the differential privacy literature, randomized response, which is much more general than that little example that I showed you, is called the local model. And the local model has become the subject of intense interest because it pushes the trust boundary for a lot of things out to the data subject. So if you have some big system or you have a big world and you want to know what people are doing on their clients, you have pushed the trust boundary out to the clients. So for example, Google is using a differential privacy in the local model in the Chrome browser in order to estimate the prevalence of malware. So for example, when you launch, the kinds of things they're looking for is when you launch your website and you launch your browser and you think you're going to CNN.com, but you're really going to evil twin of CNN.com. That's the kind of thing that they're trying to measure, how prevalent that kind of thing is. And they're doing a lot of interesting things, and they're using differential privacy to do the analysis. In other words, we are beyond what Warner started with in 1965, and there's math that helps them. Now, here's another kind of thing. Real valued functions. So A lot of computations on data involve producing numbers, real numbers. So here's an example. I have a bunch of data points indicated in blue, and I want to compute some function f on this data set. My data set is x, so I'm interested in f of x, and that's indicated by the red star. Now, if I add another data point, then I have a new database called y, and f of y may not be the same as f of x, right? For interesting functions, they will change when you change the data set. So it moves the answer to the yellow star instead of the red star. Okay? Now, the key to how we achieve differential privacy in this particular technique, the addition of random noise, is precisely to add random noise to obscure the difference between f of x and f of y. So maybe when the data set, when the data set is x, so this is the information f of x, well, this will be the most likely outcome, but you know, these other values that I might report happen with smaller and smaller probability. Right? This is a probability distribution on what I'm going to report, what I'm going to claim is f of x. I'm very likely not to tell you the truth, but hopefully I'll tell you something that's near the truth. And that's what that probability bump in the middle is, near the true value. So let's say this is the probability distribution when the database is x, and this is the probability distribution when the database is y. And differential privacy says that for any particular possible answer, say this value here, the ratio between these two things should be bounded by e to the epsilon. Between those two probabilities is bounded by e to the epsilon. And so now the question is kind of how much noise do we need to be adding? We need enough noise somehow to obscure the difference between f of x and f of y. So we define the sensitivity of the function, which we call delta f, to be the maximum possible difference in the value of f when it's applied to two adjacent databases. So it's the biggest difference possible. So think about it this way. Suppose my data, the presence or absence of my data, could swing the value of this function f a lot. Then we have to add noise that has very wide variance in order to hide whether I'm there or not. So the kind of the size of the noise, the width of that bump has to be big. It has to be at least as big as f of x minus f of y, right? If something is very likely answer when I am in the data set, it had better be pretty likely when I'm not in the data set, and vice versa. Okay. So informally, what we learn is that to achieve epsilon 0 differential privacy, it's enough to add symmetric noise that's scaled to this quantity, the sensitivity divided by the privacy parameter. So let's just see that these are in the right directions. We've seen that if my data can swing the value of the function a lot, then I need big variance and big standard deviation. That's delta f, and that's in the numerator where it belongs. Now, the privacy parameter, smaller epsilon is better privacy. And as your intuition tells you, if you want really good privacy, you probably want a lot of variance in your noise. You want to really hide what's going on. And indeed, when epsilon is small, that's exactly what we have because epsilon is in the denominator. So this is the noise. This is the sort of the parameters of the noise. And notice that it depends only on the function to be computed and on the privacy parameter. How you generate the noise has nothing to do with the database. So you can make the model completely public, and everybody will know exactly what distribution the noise is being drawn from, and it has nothing to do with the data, so it doesn't compromise privacy. That distribution doesn't compromise privacy. Now, a really special case for computing with data that we're very, very interested in is sort of counting queries. How many people in the database are over 6 feet tall? We'll come back to these in a moment. But the key thing there is these are quantities where when you have more people in the data set, the numbers grow. but the amount of noise that we're adding is not growing. The distribution on noise depends on the function and on epsilon and not the size of the database at all. So as we have more and more people, the noise is being dwarfed. It's becoming insignificant. So this was a definition that was built specifically with internet scale data sets in mind. And we call that sometimes privacy in the land of plenty, where data are really plentiful. It is not the right tool for privacy-preserving analysis of a data set of people with rare disease. Do not try it, you won't get interesting information. You'll just get noise. It's for big data sets. Here's a very specific theorem. I told you the general informal version of the theorem. Here's a very specific distribution, the Laplace distribution. And for those of you into these things, the probability density function and the standard deviation and the variance are there. Okay, so this gives epsilon 0 differential privacy. Now, suppose instead of answering just a single real value, I want the answer to your query is some point in high dimensional space, in k-dimensional space. What do you do then? Well, essentially the same technique works, although instead of looking at the absolute value of the difference between f of x and f of y, now that these things are high dimensional, f of x is a high dimensional vector, and f of y is a high dimensional vector, we use what's called their one norm, which is basically just this, it's exactly the sum of the differences, of the absolute values of the differences in each coordinate. And so you can achieve epsilon differential privacy by adding Laplace noise drawn from this quantity to every coordinate. And in particular, suppose now I want to ask many different questions, and let's make our lives really easy. Let's say many different real-valued questions. Like, remember that pair of questions in the differencing attack? How many people, members of the House of Representatives, and how many other than the speaker? That would be k equal to 2. I would be asking 2 counting queries. All right? And again, what we're interested in is the maximum over all pairs of adjacent data sets of the one norm of those difference. And you'll see this in a second. Counting queries. So counting queries, again, how many people in the data set satisfy property P? Like, they're over 6 feet tall, they eat only muffin tops, or they have one left foot and one right foot. Okay? Each of these is a counting query. And what we've just seen is that if I have k counting queries, then it is enough to add noise that's drawn from a Laplace distribution with parameter k over epsilon to each one. And that's because for any given counting query, my presence or absence, or the presence or absence of the Speaker of the House, can only change the value of the query by 1. So in this sum here, when we sum over all the queries, the value of the counting query on x versus the value on neighboring y, that difference is bounded by 1, and there are k of them, so the whole sum is bounded by k. And the reason, oh yeah, so that's written out in its full glory. Great. Why did I put delta in there? Because almost inevitably somebody says, what if I want to add Gaussian noise? And the answer is, for those of you who wanted to ask that, is you can ask Gaussian noise, but you can't do that with delta 0. And so you get something that looks like this. We pay this sort of square root log of 1 over delta, ick. But the good thing is we moved from the 1 norm to the 2 norm now. And that's the square root of the sums of the squares of the differences. And the reason that's interesting is for the 1 norm, for those counting queries, we had a k here. But for the 2 norm, we get a square root of k, which turns out to be a huge savings in many situations. So, all right, that's enough. There is a very rich, oh, you had a question?
Why is it realistic that you know k in advance?
You don't have to know k in advance. There are various strategies that you can use. One, of course, is that you might say, I'm going to be answering certain types of questions in a certain way, and I want to assign a certain amount of privacy budget total, and I'm going to split it up this way. But here's something simple you could do if you don't know in advance. And it's stupid, but it's just a simple answer to your question. I'll blow half of my privacy budget on the first query, epsilon over 2. I'll blow half of the remaining budget on the next query, epsilon over 4, and so on and so forth. So I don't really need to know in advance.
The user can keep asking, submitting more and more queries, right? Eventually,
Great. Give me 1 minute, okay? So before I go to that, you're right. Before I get there, though, as I said, we can make complicated differentially private analyses from simple differentially private building blocks. And just as in algorithm design more generally, where you can do all sorts of things with addition and multiplication, when you design a good algorithm, you have to think very, very hard about how do you combine your basic computational actions. And so there's a very, very rich literature now that addresses this. And these are the kinds of things that people have looked at. I won't actually read these, but just take a second and look at them. And there's also now a book that Aaron Roth and I wrote that's available legally and for free on the web. So the Algorithmic Foundations of Differential Privacy. Now, back to the question. It's not a panacea, even for private data analysis. It's not a panacea. That fundamental law of information recovery is a fundamental law. It's still there. Overly accurate estimates to too many statistics is blatantly non-private. The nice thing about differential privacy is that at least for a really interesting class of queries, what we can achieve comes right up against the lower bounds. So we're very close to the best possible. But no technique, no other technique can get around the fundamental law. It's why I told you about the fundamental law before I told you about differential privacy, and it was known before differential privacy was known. Okay. Having said that, what do we do about this? People will say, I have this big data set, and you're telling me I have to stop using it after a while? What is that? You know, I can't do that. I'm making money off whatever. Okay, these are real concerns, and I don't have an answer. I mean, yeah, it's true. And I think that one possible stepping stone, and this is some joint work with Deirdre, one possible stepping stone for understanding what's going on is to try to develop some clue about the rate at which privacy is burned. So here's a proposal. Is have an epsilon registry where people who are basically making money off of data or using data for scientific work or whatever, they publish the rate at least at which they are burning through epsilon. I'm burning through an epsilon of 10 every 6 hours or every 6 days or something like that. And I would say penalize people if they have an epsilon of infinity. Like they have to try. They have to try. And there are a lot of reasons that I like this, and I'm looking forward to completely developing this approach. So first of all, there is like the idea of basing privacy law on environmental law is not new, and there's some really nice writings along these lines that seem pretty compelling. Another thing is that I sit around and I make stuff up, and I say, yeah, this would be a good problem to solve in a differentially private way. But there are people who are really in the trenches with the data who not only know what are the right calculations to be carried out, they have a financial incentive to figuring out, to finding out perhaps how to do it in a privacy-preserving way, and they know the data. That is to say, they might be able to use domain information in order to avoid having to solve problems in their total generality, because total generality often makes things more expensive, more difficult, less accurate. So, and perhaps the rate at which different companies burn through privacy could be something on which they compete. Like one would like to do less because maybe it will attract your business or your usage. So in the last 5 minutes or so, I want to now switch to a very, very surprising application of differential privacy. And this is really new work, but I don't know, I want to tell you about it. Okay, so I'm going to call it correctness protection. So how many people here are aware of that paper by Ioannidis, why most published results are false? Yeah, just a few people. Okay, so false discovery in science is a big problem. And there are a lot of things that contribute to it. And I'm not going to go through that. I'm always on the defensive side here, in like not breaking stuff, but trying to fix it. So in particular, though, there are a lot of efforts to try to figure out how to avoid this problem. So there's a whole lot of work on controlling the false discovery rate in what's called multiple hypothesis testing. Remember we talked about that genome-wide association study early on? You could think of that as multiple hypothesis testing, where each SNP is a hypothesis. The hypothesis is this SNP is, the null would be, this SNP is not related to the disease. This SNP is not related to the disease. No. And the whole point is to find some of those that you can reject because the evidence show that they're more likely to actually be related to the disease. So you have a whole bunch of hypotheses, right? And in that setting, the one like with the genome-wide association study, they're fixed in advance. They're all laid out. We know in advance what they are. And people, but they're not always known in advance. People have lots of different techniques besides that one for hypothesis testing to deal with testing the results of data analysis, like sophisticated cross-validation techniques or the use of holdout sets. But most of the theory is for the static case, where the hypotheses are fixed in advance. And that's, again, illustrated in this genome-wide association study case. However, science is an adaptive process, right? And there's a wonderful quote from the statistician Tukey that says, "We often forget how science and engineering function. Ideas come from previous exploration more than from lightning strokes." So what it means is, well, the next study is inspired by the results of the previous study. The next question is inspired by the outcome to the previous question. And that's adaptive. It's not static, it's adaptive. And things are going to get worse because it used to be that if you wanted to do a new study, you might go off and find a new data set, and you have fresh data on which to carry out your study. But now people will be working with very, very large data sets, and getting a new data set is not feasible. It doesn't make any sense. You can't go out and, get whole new whatever anymore. Everybody studies the same data sets, or you'll have a lot more incidents of that. So it's going to get a lot worse. So what's going on in adaptivity, by definition, is simply that the ith question depends on the answers you got to the first I-1 questions. That's all it says. And the worry is that when the analyst is interacting with the data set, she's going to come up with a query for which the data set is no longer representative of the population from which it's drawn. That's overfitting. And then she announces a surprising discovery, and we have false discovery in science. So the key thing that I wanted to tell you is that differential privacy will neutralize the risks that are incurred by adaptivity. It won't stop the problems from the static case, but it neutralizes the adaptivity case. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the intuition. Just a slide. So think about it this way. let's fix a query. What fraction of the population is over 6 feet tall? Let's say this question is fixed in advance. We haven't even gotten the data set yet. Now we go out and we recruit a data set using good statistical sampling practices. Right? If that data set is large, then with very, very high probability, the fraction of people in that data set over 6 feet tall will be representative of the fraction of people in the population as a whole who are over 6 feet tall. That's why statistics works, right? That's what it does. So almost all large data sets will give an approximately correct reply. The way I would like to phrase that is most data sets are representative of the population as a whole with respect to that query. That was my first query, though. So suppose in the process of interacting with the data set, the analyst finds a query for which the data set is not representative. Okay. Now, we already agreed that if the data set hadn't been drawn yet, when it gets drawn, it will almost surely be representative of the query. So when she had no information about the data set, when you drew it, it would be representative for the query with very high probability. So if in the course of her interactions she finds some question for which that data set is no longer representative, then what it actually means is she has learned something about the data set. She's learned about the data set and not the population as a whole. So intuitively, if you preserve the privacy of the data, you can see there's a little window here that will perhaps allow us to prevent overfitting. And that turns out to be the case. Now, if you tell this to people who work with data, I know from experience, because of just the privacy preserving aspect, they'll say, but, get lost. We don't want to hear from you. We want to do things the way we always have. Go away with your differential privacy interference. Okay? And I'm going to say, go ahead. Make my day. But when you want to interact with a holdout set the way you were going to do in the past in order to validate your conclusions, interact with the holdout set, only the holdout set, in a differentially private way. Now, I'm not going to explain that because we're just about out of time, so I'll just tell you what we do with the reusable holdout. So you have a data set, it's randomly partitioned into two pieces, holdout and training. The general idea usually is that you do whatever you want doing your data analysis on the training set, then you go and you check with the holdout set to make sure your conclusions are valid. Because your holdout data was drawn from the same distribution as your training data, if you have overfit to your training data, you will catch that on the holdout set. That's what goes on. But then you're done. It's like you can't reuse the holdout set because if you do, then the questions, your next discoveries are no longer independent of the holdout set. They don't count as fresh for checking validity. So here's a reusable holdout set. Learn on the training set. You check against the holdout via a differentially private mechanism. This will give you useful information about the distribution without letting you learn much about the holdout set. So future exploration will not significantly depend on the holdout set. You will not overfit to it. And intuitively, it just stays fresh. So, in conclusion, private data analysis is an old problem. Differential privacy gives a general solution concept that is robust to all sorts of auxiliary information in a networked world. And there is no competing theory of privacy-preserving data analysis. There just isn't one. And finally, the approach is telling us something. We are learning now that the approach is telling us something beyond privacy. It's telling us something fundamental about computing with stability guarantees. And that has been useful in the economics literature and more recently now with the concept of the reusable holdout set. Thank you.
So much, Cynthia. Let's see if there are questions. If there
Thank you. This is my first introduction to differential privacy. So could you explain the application of it in the Google Chrome browser? How does that work in a little
Sure.
more detail to computer scientist types?
So I'm trying to remember the exact details of what they did, and a different application is coming to mind and it's interfering.
Or any application.
Yeah, okay. So let's make this really easy. Let's suppose that what Google is trying to do is find out whether a browser is going to one of some, when it is launched, is going to one of some particular set of possible sites that Google knows about. Okay? So imagine now that there's a bit which is 1 if it's going to one of those on the list, and it is 0 otherwise. Okay? Now it is running essentially randomized response on those bits. Like being on the list is like having XYZ last night, and being off the list is not having XYZ last night. So now they run randomized response. One of the things that they do that is, and therefore they're finding out the approximate fraction of the population that is running Chrome, that for which when they launch Chrome it's going to a bad site. Okay. It is for diagnostic purposes. It's not remedial.
It's not helping the individual. It's for diagnostic generally.
It's for diagnostic generally, but I assume what they will do is issue some sorts of patches or whatever to the browser if they decide there's a big enough problem. Is that a sufficient answer? Great. Okay. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry. You had a question. The mic is.
I actually have two questions. One is how does honesty figure in? Because I can imagine that even if the interviewer says you're gonna have this privacy and nobody's gonna know your answer, they may lie anyway. And
Yes.
the other question is, what if I want people to listen to me, and they aren't?
I do not have a solution for getting people to listen to you when they're not. I'm sorry. Honesty, of course, is very important. Now, if you're asking, and again, honesty is outside of the control of computer science. However, there are people who work in programming languages and security who are working on building systems where they can sort of ensure end-to-end that they're differentially private. So you can use all of the formal methods that the programming languages field develops for these kinds of things. Okay, so that can check that the program does satisfy the claims. But if the data analyst is simply not trustworthy, whoever has the data is not trustworthy, there are two solutions. One is to revert to the local model where you don't trust, the whole point was you didn't trust the center. And the other solution, at least in theory, is to use the miracle of modern science, which is secure function evaluation, also known as multi-party computation, secure multi-party computation, which is a literature from cryptography on basically how you could think of it kind of as a very broadly distributed implementation of a trusted center where a lot of people would have to get together to collude to ruin it. But that's at least a theoretical solution. I wouldn't recommend that right now. Yeah.
So why is there no competing theory, and what's your expectation in that respect?
So I don't know exactly why there's no competing theory, but I do have a conjecture. And it's unproven. If you sat down and made a list of certain properties that you wanted something to ensure for you, like immunity to arbitrary side information and an ability to analyze cumulative loss under composition and a few other properties, those things might end up literally implying some version of differential privacy. And there is some work that's going on at Stanford, John Ducci and a student whose name I don't know, where they've literally been writing down a few different things that you might want from a privacy notion and showing that these are implying differential privacy, or at least one of the variants. So it may be that it's just inherent.
If I might follow that, so would you consider privacy a permanently lost power, where we're just sort of each learning all the time? In other words, if there's no solution to this problem.
Well, there is a solution that lets you get a certain amount of utility in a privacy-preserving way, and there's no solution, there can't be a solution beyond that. Yeah. Sure. Okay, hi.
Cynthia, imagine that we have a public database, for example, one that is collected using federal funds.
Yes,
So it's intended as a public good.
yes.
Can we imagine what type of mechanism based on differential privacy could be put in place so that it can support a sequence of queries both now and into the future, while at the same time having some well-specified privacy budget? Is that maybe perhaps there's already a concrete real-world example of that, or in the absence of that, what might some of the design issues be, given that it's a public good?
Very, very tough question. And there are many ways to break this question into pieces and try to answer parts of it. If the whole point here is that this is a public good, the public has to make some decisions about what it wants to do with a fundamental conflict of desires, right? One real desire is for a certain kind of privacy, and one real desire is for ongoing huge amounts of utility.
Public census, would it be a...
Right. So, but...
Or maybe that's a red herring.
So, what I'm saying is there is no substitute for, if you really want data to be used for a long time with lots and lots of utility, you have to make a sacrifice. I mean, just to make this extreme, I've often been asked, what if there's some horrible epidemic? And it's like, if there's some horrible epidemic, look at the data and figure out what to do. I mean, it's clear how you want to do things. Especially with the census, where not only is it a public good, but all of the things, there's some sense, when you say census, there's some sense in which it's not even just some researchers who are supposed to know what's in there, but in fact the public as a whole. So you can't even use ideas like, okay, well, I'll give this group a privacy budget of epsilon 1 and this group a privacy budget of epsilon 2. You can't do anything like that. But there's just no getting around the fundamental law. So at least with census, the data do change over time. And having completely fresh data can be helpful. But it's unfortunately, this is an idea that we've investigated. Unfortunately, database churn is not as protective as we had hoped. In fact, it's astonishingly less protective than we had thought it would be.
Hi. Speaking of deadly epidemics, honesty, and the federal government doing public goods research,
Yes.
back in the 1980s, it was very important to figure out what high-risk sexual behaviors
Right.
people were engaged in,
Right.
and the Warner method was piloted extensively. In the end, Congress, with brilliant people like Jesse Helms involved, didn't fund fundamental knowledge about, the basic knowledge about how risky
Right.
how prevalent different risky behaviors were. But it involved research to try to validate the honesty and figure out how much noise to add, and it was about 20% noise. So there was a spinner, and I think 4 out with 5 sectors.
Yes.
And if it landed on one of the sectors, then
I see. This is what people felt comfortable with. Or they would be
so
honest
somewhere
with.
in the
Yes.
NIH public good records,
Right.
someone did that validation study. It was in a very contentious time about a
Yes.
fundamentally vital epidemic underway, and that method was argued for and tested, and it captured my imagination. That's why I remember it 30 years later.
So it was 20% probability of lying or telling the truth?
20% lying. 20% lying
Okay.
apparently made people feel comfortable about that
Right.
level of plausible
That's pretty low.
deniability.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is pretty low.
Yeah,
When
great.
it's about behaviors that at that time were very stigmatized.
So that's great. Thank you for telling me that. I'll remember that. Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk. With the Warner method, it's very intelligible to the user about how that noise is introduced. They themselves have a model of the noise being introduced.
Right.
In fact, they're the ones introducing that noise.
Yes.
And so that's one thing, that they can actually themselves have a model for and be able to make predictions about, or at least have a level of comfort with that.
Right.
And the second is that that's impossible to circumvent that, because the noise is introduced at the point of acquisition of the data as opposed to later on. So what do you feel about that? The intelligibility from the perspective of the average user about
Yeah.
the noise that's introduced as opposed to something that's introduced later on down the road?
I appreciate the point about it being intelligible to the user and helping people to feel comfortable with it. It is limiting. You can't do as much in the local model as you can do in the centralized model. So for simple things, it's great, but after a while, it does kind of break down a bit. So there's that trade-off now between people being comfortable and whatever. My hope, of course, is that there is some way to, Lee, you've been hearing me talk about this for years. Is it getting easier to understand?
I think one of the really interesting applications of the model is when the data is being collected anyway. One of the examples, the example that Cynthia and I are explaining of smart data, energy usage data, it is being collected, it's being acquired by in a situation where it's just factually going to be the accurate data. So everyone knows that people have become less comfortable with it because of the privacy implications of the analysis of energy usage data. And differential privacy then provides at least a mechanism by which you can think constructively about how to use or how to protect at the same time this very, very large data set of all of our households' energy. And the question that you raised sort of doesn't quite, it sort of end up like this, because you're already, that data is already being collected. And one of the features of the big data environment is precisely that. There is a great deal of data that is being collected. The consent issue is a different one, it's beyond the scope, but it is being collected. It is being collected without people's opportunity to control it. So in many ways, the differential private mechanisms are really, very promising trajectory. We're trying to preserve privacy even in the face of that kind of, which I don't know if everybody wants to.
Or if we simply beat you into submission.
Hi, I have 2 questions, so I'll start with the first one. So far we've heard many examples of the Warner method, which I think is easy to understand. But I'm wondering, can you identify any current practical applications that use some of these more complicated methods, such as adding the Laplacian noise and things of that sort?
Current practical applications. So we are working on, we've finished a scope and design project, and we will be building a pilot differentially private system for certain kinds of reporting of these data. That's one place. Another is Unime O'Reilly is at MIT is building differentially private tools for modeling MOOC data, student behavior, aggregate information about student behavior. So there are several other pilot stages. Also, there's a U.S. Census Bureau website. The project was called On the Map, and it gives information about where people work and where workers live. And it uses synthetic data, but the synthetic data were generated using differentially private methods. Not randomized response, something else.
So when you're building these systems, is the approach to build something like, let's say, take MySQL as a model and then try to implement each of those functions in a way that is differentially private?
So that would be a very reasonable thing to do. Oh gosh, that actually reminds me, there are also some programming platforms. So there's PINQ, which is Privacy Integrated Queries, which was done by Frank McSherry. And there's IRAVAD, which is by Narayanan, wait, I'm not sure, Shmatakov and I don't know who else, which does a differentially private implementation of some subset of MapReduce. The issue with these platforms is that, as I sort of alluded, sometimes you have to think really hard about how to put your primitives together to get a good utility for a given amount of privacy loss algorithm, and the programming platforms don't necessarily force you to do that. But I don't know the results of people's experimenting with them.
Okay. One last question, by the way.
Sure.
So the other question is about the definition of differentially private. So I was wondering why not use a more information theoretic definition, such as so like Shannon, he set up the mathematics information, and you can just you can quantify the uncertainty in terms of the Shannon entropy, and you play games like 20 questions, right? And every time you ask a question, you reduce the conditional entropy. Why not just do that?
Okay, there are two answers to that question. So one answer is that we want a good handle on partial information. So maybe that isn't a great answer to it. I've seen a few people try to do exactly this. Somehow there have been failures. I mean, it hasn't worked out. In one case, I don't know, we figured out how to learn things you weren't supposed to learn. In particular, things that relied on mutual information and average notions, it basically ends up being the case where if you understood the population well, you could design something that would protect average people. So there are two problems. First of all, you want to protect the privacy of your outliers. And second, if you already understand your population well, why are you doing this exercise? You know, I'm sorry I'm having trouble remembering some of the details, but there were things that people tried in about the year 2000-ish. And there might have been some more recent things, but I haven't seen anything that was compelling. Sorry. Yeah.
One last question.
So this will probably be a pretty easy question. It was related to your false discovery rate stuff at the end, and the reusable holdout. Like, does that kind of fall into the other differential privacy stuff where you kind of burn through epsilon, so you make your data set live
longer? It has nothing to do with privacy anymore.
Okay. But
like
so
we're not
like
trying to protect privacy.
Then? Or is it infinitely reusable then?
Okay, great. So if you do things, okay, so what we've analyzed is the case where you are essentially checking the results of not counting queries, but answers to what fraction of the population satisfy a certain property. You know, that kind of query.
Okay.
Estimating means in machine language speak. So that's an area where there's a whole lot of research on differential privacy, and you can do some very surprising things. We don't need to know the actual estimates from the holdout set. We can give to the holdout set a guess. Here's what we're estimating from the training data, and we can say, are we close to being right? Now, the answer to the question of are we close to being right is only one bit. It's not the answer to what is the fraction on the holdout set. And that turns out to liberate us quite extensively to the following degree. If the number of times, so we can handle only about the square of the size of the holdout set answers of the form no, because when the answer is no, you've got it wrong, it leaks more information. But if the answer is yes, we can actually handle an exponential number of those.
Okay.
So you can really do quite a lot, and if your methods on your training set aren't always leading you to overfit, you'll get a lot of mileage out of this.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
All right, let's give Cynthia another big round.
Thank you.